You won't believe what happened when one of the most generous men on the planet came across an elderly man struggling just to walk. The old man was using sticks as crutches, his hands trembling with every step he took. But then, something incredible unfolded, something so unexpected that it would change both their lives forever. It was a crisp morning in North Carolina when Jimmy Donaldson, better known as MrBeast, decided to take a quiet drive through the countryside. He wasn't filming or planning anything big that day, just enjoying some time away from the chaos of his wildly successful YouTube career. But sometimes, life has other plans. As he drove down a narrow dirt road surrounded by tall trees, something caught his eye. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of his vision, a figure walking slowly along the side of the road. When Jimmy slowed down to get a closer look, what he saw stopped him cold. There, hobbling along with great difficulty, was an elderly man clutching two thin wooden sticks. They weren't proper crutches. They looked like branches he'd picked up from somewhere. His shoes were worn out, almost falling apart, and his clothes were patched together as if they'd been stitched multiple times over the years. Every step seemed painful, yet the man kept moving forward, determined not to give up. Jimmy parked his car and got out. "Hey there," he said gently, approaching the man. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The elderly man turned around, startled but polite. His name was Walter, and he explained that he lived alone in a small cabin nearby. Years ago, an accident had left him unable to work, and without family or much money, he'd learned to make do with whatever he could find. Those sticks? They were all he had to support himself after his old crutches broke months ago. Walter didn't ask for sympathy. He seemed almost embarrassed to be seen this way, but Jimmy could see the toll it had taken on him. Living like this wasn't easy, and it was clear that Walter had been doing everything he could just to survive. That's when Jimmy made a decision that would turn Walter's world upside down and inspire millions around the globe. Jimmy didn't waste any time. He knew he had to do something big. But as he stood there talking to Walter, he realized this wasn't just about fixing a pair of broken crutches. This was about giving someone back their dignity, their independence, and maybe even a little bit of hope. "Come on," Jimmy said with a warm smile. "Let's get you off these sticks." Walter hesitated at first. People passing by often promised things they never delivered, and he'd learned not to trust easily. But there was something different about Jimmy, something genuine in his eyes, that made Walter nod slowly. Jimmy helped Walter into his car and drove him to a nearby medical supply store. There he picked out the best crutches money could buy. Sturdy, adjustable, and designed for comfort. Walter looked at them like they were a miracle, but Jimmy wasn't done yet. "I want to see where you live," Jimmy told him, "just to make sure everything's okay." Walter tried to protest, saying his home wasn't much, but Jimmy insisted. When they arrived at the small cabin tucked deep in the woods, it became clear why Walter had been so reluctant. The place was falling apart. The roof sagged under years of wear, the windows were cracked, and the inside was sparse, with only a rickety table, an old mattress on the floor, and a tiny wood-burning stove for heat. Jimmy walked around quietly, taking it all in. He could see how hard Walter had worked to keep the place standing, but it was clear that living here was no easy feat for someone in his condition. And then, something caught Jimmy's eye, a stack of unpaid bills on the table, utility notices, medical debt, reminders of overdue taxes. It was overwhelming. Walter noticed Jimmy looking at the papers and quickly shuffled them away. "It's nothing," he muttered, trying to downplay the situation. "I'll figure it out." But Jimmy wasn't having it. He sat down across from Walter and said firmly, "No, you won't have to figure it out alone anymore. We're going to fix this together." That's when Jimmy came up with a plan, a bold, life-changing plan. He called his team and explained what was happening. Within hours, trucks began arriving at Walter's cabin, loaded with tools, materials, and supplies. Neighbors who rarely saw anyone come down this remote road started gathering, curious about the sudden commotion. For Walter, it felt surreal. One moment, he was struggling just to survive, and the next, Dozens of people were working tirelessly to transform his world. New roofing went up, walls were repaired, and fresh paint brightened the once dreary exterior. Inside, furniture replaced the worn-out pieces, appliances were installed, and heaters ensured Walter wouldn't have to endure another freezing winter. But Jimmy didn't stop there. He paid off all of Walter's debts, the medical bills, the taxes, everything. It was as if a massive weight had been lifted off Walter's shoulders, one he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for so long. As the sun set over the horizon, casting golden light over the newly renovated cabin, Walter sat on his porch for the first time in years without pain shooting through his legs. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." Jimmy simply smiled and replied, "You don't have to. Just promise me one thing, don't ever lose hope again." But even as everyone celebrated, a question lingered in the air. Why had Walter been left behind by society? How many others were out there, struggling silently, waiting for someone to notice? And then, something unexpected happened. Just as Walter was starting to believe his life might finally turn around, Jimmy received a phone call that changed everything. It was from a local journalist who had caught wind of the project at the cabin. She wanted to write a story about it, about how one act of kindness had transformed an elderly man's life. At first, Jimmy hesitated. He didn't do things for attention, he did them because they were the right thing to do. But then he realized this could be bigger than just Walter. If people heard about Walter's story, maybe they'd start paying attention to others like him. People who were forgotten, overlooked, or struggling in silence. The article came out a few days later, and it spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded with shares, and soon, thousands of messages poured in from strangers inspired by what Jimmy had done. Some sent donations, others offered to volunteer, and many simply thanked Jimmy for reminding them of the power of compassion. But amidst all the positivity, something darker emerged. A woman claiming to be Walter's long-lost niece reached out, saying she hadn't seen him in decades, but wanted to reconnect now that his story was public. At first, it seemed like a heartwarming twist, family coming back together after years apart. Jimmy arranged for her to visit, hoping it would bring Walter even more joy. But when she arrived, something felt off. She barely looked at Walter, instead focusing on the newly renovated cabin and asking questions about its value. Her tone was polite, but distant, and Walter grew visibly uncomfortable. Later that night, Jimmy overheard her on the phone outside. "Yes, I think we can sell it," she whispered. "With the upgrades, it's worth a lot more now." Jimmy froze. Was she trying to take advantage of Walter, to profit off the home he'd worked so hard to keep? Anger bubbled inside him, but he knew he couldn't jump to conclusions. Instead, he decided to dig deeper, to uncover the truth about this woman and her intentions. What he discovered shocked him. Records showed she hadn't been in contact with Walter for over 20 years, not since a bitter family feud drove them apart. And now, here she was, showing up out of nowhere, ready to swoop in and claim what wasn't hers. Walter was devastated when Jimmy told him. All those years of loneliness suddenly made sense. His own family had abandoned him, leaving him to fend for himself. Now, just as things were looking up, someone was trying to take it all away again. Jimmy stepped in, determined to protect Walter no matter what. He hired lawyers to ensure the cabin stayed in Walter's name, and confronted the woman, telling her in no uncertain terms that she wouldn't get away with exploiting an elderly man. As the confrontation unfolded, Walter watched silently, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in years, he felt like someone truly cared about him, someone willing to fight for him. But just as things seemed to settle down, another bombshell dropped. While going through old documents, Jimmy found a letter addressed to Walter, but it wasn't recent. It was dated 10 years ago, written by a charity organization offering financial assistance. The letter had never been opened. Why hadn't Walter received it? Who had kept it from him? And most importantly, how many other opportunities had slipped through his fingers because of forces beyond his control? The answers lay hidden somewhere, buried in secrets that stretched far beyond this small cabin in the woods. secrets that could expose a system failing people like Walter every single day. And as Jimmy stared at the unopened envelope, one thought echoed in his mind: this isn't over.